Okay, let's dive right into this because today, in this explainer, we are looking at a truly mind-bending reality of climate success. We hear so much about emissions targets and, honestly, climate struggles, right? But today we're going to unpack a completely different story. We're exploring some absolutely fascinating insights shared by Tshering Tobgay, the former Prime Minister of Bhutan, to figure out exactly how one single country is completely flipping the script on global warming.
And that brings us to the big question that hooks you right from the start. Out of the 200-odd countries in the world today, you hear a ton of talk about becoming carbon neutral. But Bhutan? They aren't just carbon neutral. They are literally the only country on Earth that is actually carbon negative. I mean, just think about that for a second. They are pulling more greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere than they are putting in. So how is one small country pulling off something that the major global superpowers are still just dreaming about?
Now, you might immediately think, well, they must be incredibly wealthy, right? Just throwing unlimited resources at green tech. Nope. Bhutan's entire gross domestic product is under $2 billion. As Tobgay hilariously points out, there are individual people walking around today whose personal net worth is higher than the entire economy of his country. So they're achieving this completely unparalleled environmental milestone without massive wealth.
And honestly, it gets even more incredible when you look at their geographic reality. Bhutan is a small, developing nation with barely 700,000 people, and they are surviving right up in the Himalayas, sandwiched directly between two of the most populated and heavily industrialized countries on the planet, China and India. They aren't some mystical, isolated Shangri-La populated only by happy monks, like the stereotype sometimes goes. They are a very real country doing their absolute best to survive, and yet they are absolutely thriving.
Let's move on to the driving philosophy, gross national happiness.
To really understand how they do this, we have to look at the why. And it all stems from this concept of gross national happiness, or GNH. It's a completely holistic approach to development. So instead of just relentlessly chasing money and GDP, Bhutan carefully balances economic growth with social development, environmental sustainability, and cultural preservation. And this mission drives some incredible social benefits for them. Education is completely free for all citizens, so is healthcare, everything from basic consultations to medicines. It also preserves their incredibly unique culture, right down to their national dress. The men wear a robe called dago, which, fun fact, features the world's biggest pocket. It wraps all the way around the back and can literally hold anything from phones and iPads to entire office files.
And this isn't just some new marketing buzzword. This pioneering vision actually dates back to the 1970s, introduced by the fourth king of Bhutan. And speaking of their kings, they are astonishingly progressive. I mean, in a world where people usually have to fight and bleed for democratic rights, Bhutan's king literally used the constitution to impose democracy on a population that wasn't even asking for it. He even included provisions that empower the people to impeach their monarchs, and he mandated a royal retirement age of 65. In fact, the fourth king stepped down at the absolute peak of his popularity when he was only 51 years old.
So let's look at the mechanics of carbon negativity.
Getting right into the actual mechanics here, Bhutan's very constitution, the exact same one that gave them democracy, demands that a minimum of 60% of the country's total land must remain under forest cover for all time. They are legally bound to protect their trees. But they aren't just meeting the bare minimum, they are vastly overperforming. Right now, a staggering 72% of Bhutan is covered in pristine forest. And the carbon math behind this success is pretty amazing to break down. On one side, the entire country of Bhutan generates roughly 2.2 million tons of carbon dioxide. But on the flip side, because of that massive 72% pristine forest cover we just talked about, their forests act as this giant net carbon sink. They sequester more than 4 million tons of CO2 every single year. So their trees are basically breathing in roughly 3 times the amount of carbon the entire country emits. But wait, it actually goes even further than that internal sink. Bhutan generates a ton of renewable electricity from its fast-flowing rivers, and they export the excess clean energy to their neighbors. Currently, that export offsets about 6 million tons of carbon dioxide in their neighborhood. Their goal for 2020 was to export enough to offset 17 million tons, and if they harness just half of their total hydropower potential, they could offset 50 million tons of carbon dioxide a year. To put that into perspective, that is more CO2 than the entire city of New York generates in a single year.
Now, keeping this status requires constant, everyday action. It's not just a few laws written on paper, it's an absolute flurry of daily green initiatives. For example, they provide free electricity to rural farmers. Why?
So those farmers no longer have to chop down trees and burn firewood just to cook their food. The government also heavily subsidizes things like electric vehicles and LED lights. They are pushing their entire government to go completely paperless. And they have national programs like Green Bhutan, which drives massive nationwide tree planting efforts.
And right at the core of this whole strategy are their protected areas. More than half the country is protected as national parks, reserves, and wildlife sanctuaries. But here is the truly amazing part. They haven't just created isolated little islands of nature. They have connected all these protected areas through a massive network of biological corridors. This allows animals to roam freely and safely right across the entire country. Tobgay shares this absolutely vivid anecdote of a single tiger that was spotted down in the hot subtropical jungles at 250 meters above sea level. And then, 2 years later, that exact same tiger was spotted way up near 4,000 meters in their freezing alpine mountains. I mean, that is conservation in action.
Which brings us to a harsh reality, the existential threat of climate change.
Sadly, there is a really dramatic irony to their situation. Here we have a country doing absolutely everything right, yet they are facing severe, immediate consequences from a global crisis they didn't even create. Right now, Bhutan is contending with 2,700 glacier lakes. Because the world is getting warmer, Bhutan's glaciers are melting at an alarming rate. Decades ago, these were solid glaciers. Today, they're swelling lakes. And when these lakes breach their dams, they cause devastating flash floods and massive landslides, wreaking widespread destruction in the valleys below. So despite contributing virtually nothing to global warming, Bhutan's people are already bearing the brutal brunt of its consequences.
But here is how they are sustaining the future. Bhutan for life.
You know, they aren't just sitting around waiting. Bhutan first promised to remain carbon neutral for all time back in 2009 at the COP15 summit in Copenhagen, though, sadly, nobody was really listening back then. But they reiterated that promise in Paris at COP21, and this time, the world actually heard them. The challenge, of course, is funding. Keeping all those parks pristine is incredibly expensive. So they did something brilliant. They applied Wall Street logic to an environmental problem. Partnering with the World Wildlife Fund, they created Bhutan for Life. It's essentially a 15-year transition fund. They raise money from individual donors and corporations, but, and here's the kicker, the funds are only released when predetermined conservation conditions are met. It's a multi-party, single closing. Think of it like a giant Kickstarter project, but with millions of tons of carbon dioxide at stake. This fund pays for the parks for 15 years, giving the Bhutanese government the breathing room it desperately needs to grow its own economy. And then, after those 15 years, the government guarantees full funding for the parks forever.
Which leaves us with a truly provocative thought to end on. If this ingenious Kickstarter-style model can work to permanently protect the environment in a small, developing nation like Bhutan, what if we replicated it globally? What if we set up an Earth for Life Fund to kickstart this model for other countries that have the natural resources to fight climate change, but maybe just lack the current ability to invest in them? Ultimately, no matter how we dress or where we live, we are all on this planet together. Bhutan is showing us that it is 100% possible to thrive while protecting the Earth. Now, it's just up to the rest of the world to follow their lead. Thank you for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.